What sets modern history apart from the ages of prehistory is that our history is written. Our progress through time, our achievements and milestones are recorded for posterity. The Hammurabi Code, the Ten Commandments, the Bible, the Quran, these are all written records of laws we live by. American democracy, too, has a lineage of written records that we can trace and show the development of our nation. Each document builds on those before it to make our foundation of history stronger. This is Documents of Destiny. National expansion. In our program, we have 5 subject matter experts. James R. Stoner, Professor of Political Science, Louisiana State University.
So, in the early years, there was a recognition that slavery was, well, what does the phrase later become? A peculiar institution. Out of whack with the general thrust of American institutions, slavery gets abolished in the states where there aren't many slaves.
Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program, Princeton University.
So by the time we reached the 1830s and into the 1840s, the defenders of slavery are no longer defending it as a necessary evil, but rather as a positive good. Underlying this is the profound importance of slavery to the economy of the South after the invention of the cotton gin.
Clarence E. Walker, Professor of History, University of California, Davis.
And this tariff came at a time where the South felt, or was beginning to feel, that it increasingly was losing out in its relationship to the North in terms of its growth and development, and also in terms of its economic position in the Union.
Michael Segru, Research Fellow, the James Madison Program, Princeton University.
This will generate a movement towards cooperative secession, which will develop in South Carolina and extend itself out to the states of the lower South, which will eventually lead to the secession of all these states in 1860.
Kent Neumeyer, Emeritus Professor of History, University of Connecticut.
In other words, this was Calhoun's way of putting the states at the center of constitutional interpretation and of protecting the constitutional rights of the southern states. And he said, hey, this is constitutional. I mean, it was clever.
South Carolina's Ordinance of Nullification, 1832. In 1832, South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification. This was in response to new tariffs, or taxes, imposed by Congress on imported goods coming into South Carolina from foreign countries. These new tariffs were levied in 1828 and 1832. Since the people of South Carolina hated them so much, they became known as the Tariffs of Abominations. These taxes not only inflamed the ongoing conflict regarding federal versus states' constitutional powers, they also presented Andrew Jackson with the worst crisis of his presidency.
Well, the Tariff of Abominations was symbolic of a growing tension between the North and the South, and that the Tariff of Abomination placed high duties on imported goods, and it protected American manufacturers. The South was an importer of foodstuffs and machinery and clothing for the slave populations. And Southern planters saw this as a direct attack upon their economic wherewithal within the Union.
This is one of the most important developments in the progress of America towards civil war. South Carolina had always been the leading pro-slavery state in the U.S.
And quite simply, what the South Carolinians saw in the Tariff of Abominations of 1828 was an expansion of federal authority that they felt that if the government could pass a tariff like this, who was to say at some future time that the government could not pass a law abolishing the institution of slavery? That for the South Carolinians, the tariff of abomination was an early signal that slavery was in some trouble in the Union. And in reaction to this, the great South Carolinian politician John C. Calhoun came up with the doctrines of nullification and concurrent majority, which were basically tools which enabled a minority to protect itself from what it felt was the aggressive power of a majority.
If every state has the right to resist federal law and to secede from the Union, if the government persists, what would happen to the Union? It was the irresistible logic, and Jackson got the message, and he said to Calhoun and the nullifiers in South Carolina, he said, passed the Force Act, and said, look, I'm coming down there. If you guys don't work this out, we'll hang a few of you guys and settle the matter. That was a sort of typical Jackson response, but it got their attention, to say the least.
A staunch advocate of a strong union, President Jackson was outraged by South Carolina's ordinance. He also regarded any military action South Carolina might take to defend its stance on nullification as an act of treason.
If one drop of blood be shed there in defiance of the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on to the first tree I can find.
In 1833, Congress enacted a force bill. This gave President Jackson the authorization to use force to preserve the Union.
So Jackson responds, Congress responds with its force bill. Jackson makes clear his intention to enforce the force bill and to collect the tariff, and South Carolina backs down.
Jackson then dispatched several warships and hundreds of soldiers to Charleston to enforce the laws of the land.
What happened, of course, is the radicals and nullifiers backed off. They worked out a compromise tariff, but they went to the brink.
In an attempt to prevent any violence, Herry Clay again proposed another bill. The new bill would lower the tariff rates over the course of a decade. At Clay's urging, South Carolina accepted it. But even though the crisis ended, regional tensions continued to smolder. In standing firm against South Carolina's ordinance of nullification, President Jackson confirmed the power of the federal government to enforce laws even when states opposed them. The Constitution of the American Anti-Slavery Society, 1833. In the 1820s, anti-slavery sentiments that had slowly taken root during the founding of our country began to sprout heated debates. Abolitionists from all walks of life started to call for a complete end to slavery.
On the question of slavery in the American founders, it's interesting that even some of those among the founders of our country who held slaves, there was a moral unease about it. Jefferson, for example, who, from our perspective, was a notorious slaveholder, didn't think it was right. He held slaves, but he felt guilty about holding slaves. He said that he trembled for his country when he considered that God is just. And he said that specifically in reference to slavery. He thought slavery was an evil thing. It was inconsistent with the principle of equality that he himself had written into our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He knew that blacks were men, that they were human beings, just like whites, and he knew that slavery went contrary to that great principle of the equality of human beings, but he didn't know how to get rid of it. He once said that slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. We dare not let go, but we can't really live in a condition of constantly holding on to the wolf. And to his dying day, he was never really able to reconcile the matter of slavery in his own mind.
Americans were looking for an answer to this volatile issue. In 1829 and 1832, serious anti-slavery debates took place in the Virginia legislature.
The southern states wanted slavery to be untouched. The northern states preferred the abolition of slavery. And a deal was struck so that the issue was essentially avoided. It couldn't be avoided forever. We very quickly came to realize that the issue was going to continue to vex our politics until, in the end, it had to be resolved by a civil war. There is a question about why the South was so eager to defend the institution of slavery. At the beginning, slavery was thought of not as a positive good, even by its proponents, but as a necessary evil, something that we had to tolerate because it was necessary to the economy until it eventually died out.
To the north, some abolitionists supported a plan to free slaves and then send them to new settlements in Africa, in particular, Liberia.
The original position of Abraham Lincoln on the Civil War was that it was a war to preserve the Union and not destroy slavery. That if Lincoln could have brought the southern states back without disestablishing slavery, he would have. It's only over a course of 3 years of hard struggle that emancipation becomes the central focus of northern military concerns and concerns of the Union. It is the fact that if Lincoln had had his way, Lincoln would like to have colonized the black population of the United States in the Isthmus of Panama. That Lincoln, being an old-line Whig, adhered to the Whig policy of colonization. Lincoln did not think that the United States, up through 1863, could ever evolve as a biracial state. And he believed that the best thing, as he told a group of black spokesmen in 1861, that it would be best if their people, once freed, or whatever the resolution of the conflict was to be, that those people, it would be better for them to leave the United States, that they should either voluntarily go back to Africa, to Liberia, or better yet, go to this Panamanian settlement.
However, colonization as a means to cope with the slave issue received little support, especially from freed African Americans. Black abolitionist Henry Highland Garnet.
America's my home, my country. I have no other. I mourn because the accursed shade of slavery rests upon it. I love my country's flag, and I hope that soon it will be cleansed of its stains and be hailed by all nations as an emblem of freedom and independence.
Abolitionists were growing impatient with America's unwillingness to budge on the slavery issue, and the South was becoming more anxious, especially in 1833, when the American Anti-Slavery Society met in Philadelphia to adopt a constitution.
Then in 1832, England abolishes slavery in all of its colonies. And that becomes the act that revives the anti-slavery movement in the United States. So in 1833, William Lloyd Garrison founds the Anti-Slavery Society and begins to agitate for the immediate abolition of slavery.
William Lloyd Garrison was a man of very strong opinions, and he is the father of the doctrine of immediatism in American anti-slavery, which was a British idea. The idea that the slave should be immediately emancipated.
And he's joined by others. The Grimke sisters are prominent in the movement somewhat later on. And pressure begins to build for the abolition of slavery.
The Grimke sisters of South Carolina came from a slaveholding family. And they left South Carolina, became Quakers, and became very active in the anti-slavery movement. It was the work of the Grimke sisters that precipitated a crisis in abolitionism over the place of women working in the anti-slavery movement. There were many people in the anti-slavery movement who felt that women had no business in politics and felt that the Grimke sisters were crossing a boundary that women should not cross. And therefore, women should just be a secondary force in the anti-slavery movement.
Membership in the American Anti-Slavery Society mushroomed. By the 1830s, the society claimed several hundred chapters and more than 250,000 members.
The anti-slavery movement, like most major social movements in the history of the United States and other countries, was really quite a fractious thing. Anti-slavery people disagreed amongst themselves, not about the ultimate goal of getting rid of slavery, but about the means of getting there and the time frame for getting there. The hardcore, strict abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison believed that the Constitution itself was corrupt because it was born of a compromise on the question of slavery and permitted slavery, although it didn't use that term. It permitted slavery to exist in the states that wished to have it, the southern states.
One of the other great abolitionists, himself a former slave, Frederick Douglass, at first agrees with Garrison, but he comes to realize, and this is a great act of political perception on his part, Frederick Douglass comes to realize that the Constitution, in fact, in its principles, is only putting up with slavery, not encouraging it. That, in fact, he comes to say, together with several authors, and also a lawyer in Ohio named Salmon Chase, later Lincoln's appointment to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Douglass comes to argue that the Constitution is in fact an anti-slavery document. Certainly that it includes anti-slavery principles, but that in fact includes anti-slavery rules that can be put to work through the right legal strategy and through the right political strategy to lead towards the eventual abolition of slavery in the United States.
Well, Frederick Douglass was initially allied with Garrison up through the 1840s. And Douglass was the great spokesman and champion of black people in the pre-Civil War period. He was the black man who went around the country demonstrating, both physically and intellectually, that black people, when freed, could participate in American society as the equal of Caucasians.
Douglass sees that the Constitution can be made a great instrument in the long run for the abolition of slavery. He thinks no less that slavery is wrong. How could he? He lived under it and recognized in every fiber of his being the injustice of his own enslavement. But he also recognized that the abolition of laws and of the fundamental law of the country, of a country that saw its fundamental law and of all lawfulness as anchored in the Constitution, that this would be no means towards abolition of slavery.
As the anti-slavery movement grew, abolitionists met resistance not only from Southern slaveholders, but from the North as well.
Now, on the question of how quickly slavery could be gotten rid of, here again, anti-slavery people disagreed. The strict, hardcore wing of the abolitionist movement wanted slavery to be ended tomorrow. Others, like Lincoln, although he was very much opposed to slavery, didn't think it could be ended tomorrow. He thought that it would be much too disruptive. The social consequences of attempting an immediate abolition would be too great, and so he wanted simply to put slavery on the road to extinction. This made Lincoln very unpopular with the abolitionists. Now, plainly, Lincoln was unpopular with the people who supported slavery. They were prepared to secede from the Union rather than tolerate a Lincoln administration. But we shouldn't infer from that Lincoln was popular with the abolitionists. He wasn't. They thought that he was going much too slowly and that he wasn't sufficiently committed to the abolition cause.
The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. In the early 1840s, the primary foreign policy issues concerning the United States involved Great Britain. One issue was territorial boundaries.
The Webster-Ashburton Treaty was an attempt to resolve outstanding border disputes between the United States and Canada.
The Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War did not clearly define the northeastern boundary line between Canada and the United States.
So, because Canada was supported by England, and England was the world's foremost military power at the time, they made a deal to settle the northern boundary. This is the Webster-Ashburton Treaty.
A compromise was finally reached in 1842 when Secretary of State Daniel Webster met with British Foreign Minister Alexander Baring, the first Baron Ashburton.
Well, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty established pretty much the present-day boundaries of the United States and those of the Dominion of Canada. This was a product of the growing expansionist fever that swept the United States in the 1840s, in which a party or a faction in Congress calling itself Young America felt that it was America's destiny to stretch or expand way up into what would be present-day British Columbia. The British, of course, had a different idea about that. And the end result was the negotiations between Secretary of State Daniel Webster and the British Minister Ashburton over the treaty line that established the northern boundaries of the United States.
What America wanted to do or the government of America wanted to do, a large part of the influential population wanted to do in the 1840s and the 1850s, was extend its domain all the way to California, to the Pacific. But in order to do so, it had to take care of two problems: Canada and Mexico.
It was part of this idea that God gave us the right to take the continent and do with it what we wanted. We later on called it, when we moved against Mexico in the Mexican War, we called it manifest destiny. It was our destiny to expand across the continent.
Not all of the issues between the United States and Britain were settled with this treaty. Some, most notably the issue of the Oregon border, was left for a later date. Nevertheless, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty was significant in that it demonstrated America's willingness to settle disputes not by raising arms, but through diplomatic channels. The Oregon Treaty of 1846. As the United States expanded westward, one of the prized territories was the Oregon Territory. It included present-day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Also, portions of Montana, Wyoming, and British Columbia.
The Oregon Treaty smoothed out certain differences about where the boundary lines would run in the north, separating the United States from Canada.
In 1844, James K. Polk became the 11th President of the United States. A Democrat and avowed expansionist, Polk won the election running on a simple platform. He swore to annex Texas and Oregon.
It wasn't clear how far the dividing line, the border between Canada and the United States, would go. There was a substantial expansionist element in American politics that worked under the slogan 54-40 or fight. In other words, that we would get the entire Pacific coast of what's now British Columbia.
President Polk pushed to end the dispute with Britain through diplomatic means. In America's favor was the fact that thousands of Americans had settled in the region, and many more were coming. In addition, American settlers had also established a provisional government.
Cooler heads prevailed, and eventually the dividing line was set at the 49th parallel, which separated British Columbia from the state of Washington.
This dispute between the United States and Britain was resolved on June 15, 1846, with the signing of the Treaty of Washington, which later became known as the Oregon Treaty. The treaty divided the Oregon country between the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel, from the Rocky Mountains to Puget Sound, and then through the channel around Vancouver Island to the Pacific. With the signing of the Oregon Treaty, the United States of America was becoming more defined. The nation would next turn its sights on territories in the west and southwest. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo resolved a costly war between Mexico and the United States. It was a war that many saw coming and knew was inevitable. In 1836, Texas declared its independence from Mexico. 9 years later, after intense political debate, the United States annexed Texas, bringing it into the Union. Tensions between the two countries increased when President Polk sent troops to the Rio Grande. They were led by General Zachary Taylor. Though he anticipated war, President Polk needed more than Mexico's refusal to negotiate a treaty to justify one. In 1846, a skirmish broke out between American and Mexican troops on the north bank of the Rio Grande. There were 16 American casualties. Polk seized upon the news by quickly sending a message to Congress.
As war exists, and notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country.
4 days later, Congress declared war on Mexico.
It was said to be a partisan war on the part of the President, James Polk. It was thought implicated in the growing slavery controversy, for it was taken for granted that adding Texas to the country would add immensely to the power of the slave states. Since Texas was adjacent to those states, and apparently there were some beginnings of slavery in Texas as well.
In August 1847, officials from Mexico and the United States met in Guadalupe Hidalgo, a city north of Mexico's capital. Nicholas P. Trist was the U.S. representative. On February 2nd, 1848, the treaty was signed.
The happy consequence of the war, that is, the relative ease with which the Americans conquered the Mexican army, has led us, I suppose, to take for granted the outcome of the war. But it was a matter of great controversy at the time.
Tensions and conflicts between the two countries did not automatically cease with the signing of the treaty. The constitutionality of some of the provisions within the treaty were questioned and taken up by the Supreme Court. In the end, however, the United States prevailed. In looking back on history, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a critical document in that it expanded the western and southwestern boundaries of the United States.
We won the Mexican War, and in any event, cut our path across the continent and established then pretty much what would become the eventual boundaries of the United States, that what Jefferson already foresaw as this empire of liberty in that paradoxical phrase.
In other programs in this series, we'll review the treaties, laws, landmark court decisions, and similar milestones that have shaped America's destiny. Documents of Destiny.